Okay, welcome, folks, for yet another episode of Hanger DX podcast, where we discuss all the different aspects around developer experience, how different organizations think about improving developer experience, how they can improve it. Today, with us, we have Jesse here joining from Segment. I'm really excited for this conversation. We're going to dive into a lot of insights into IDP. But before that, Jesse, please start with a bit of your introduction
Yeah,
and
thank you
welcome.
for having me. So my name is Jesse Adametz. I'm currently director of engineering for Twilio Segment's infrastructure group. Um, and yeah, that's me today.
Awesome. So maybe share a bit about like what does first developer platforms or DevEx or developer productivity, what does that mean for Segment? And maybe
Yeah.
also share a bit about like given that Segment is now part of Twilio, is this
Mhm.
does that mean like kind of like they work independently or they work together on DevEx?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I mentioned, I currently lead our infrastructure group, and we have that set up to mirror what we refer to as like the developer journey. And so the first half of that is developer platform, and the latter half of that is what we call runtime platform. Ultimately, you could also think of it as for us, we build, test, deploy, run, and the run is where we have like runtime platform being observability and compute and things like that, and developer platform being on the first part of that. It's more, how do engineers get productive when they onboard quickly? How do they start developing their code? And what happens when they push that to GitHub? What happens in CI automatically? What happens with our deploy orchestration tools automatically? How much are we doing for them versus how much do they need to do for themselves? Um, you asked how that interfaces with the rest of Twilio now that Segment is a part of them. Um, today we're publicly structured as two business units. So Segment is still kind of operating its own engineering organization, its own infrastructure, things like that. I would say it's always been a great fit from a like direction of travel perspective. We're all kind of Twilio's marching towards containers. Segment's always been on containers. That puts us on similar journeys to, we adopted at Segment, we adopted Kubernetes a handful of years ago. Twilio is building their Kubernetes platform and making great progress. So everything's always been in the same direction. But today, yeah, tactically, we have two different engineering orgs with similar teams focused on similar problems. So
Very cool. And dev platform versus sort of like dev infrastructure, are there like proper hard lines between the two, or do you think like there's sort of like overlap and there is like gray areas? How do you kind of like even do team
yeah,
the
I think
structures?
there's lots of gray areas, and I think for better or worse, gray areas usually means there's unowned bits, and then unowned bits usually make their way to infrastructure organizations or like site reliability engineers and stuff. So one way or another, kind of the buck stops with us, and that's okay. Um, but yeah, I think the way we think about it tactically is, developer platform. They're there to their primary customers are internal engineers. They're there to serve those folks. We do also have part of that group a team specifically called infrastructure enablement, and their biggest focus lately is more about um, enabling people with the infrastructure, so to speak. So obviously we're then the primary stakeholder of ourselves, but being the technical nature of Segment, a lot of folks write a lot of infrastructure as code, for example, and so that team's also particularly concerned with that developer experience of writing Terraform and what that platform is of itself. They're not responsible for everyone's Terraform, but they're responsible for the experience. So
It's very cool. This actually like brings to one of the discussion topics we had during our AngerDX Zoom session, which was
yep.
standardization, right? Kind of like how do we create standard paths for other developers to follow, and kind of like also goes into paved paths. Do you want to maybe share kind of like your high level thought process behind standardization, and more specifically also like the teams? There are different types of teams. There's like front end, back end, mobile. I'm sure
Mm-hmm.
there's like other like infrastructure. How do
Yep.
you think about like standardization when there are like not even people working on the same stacks?
Yeah, totally. So I think, in that conversation, I had shared a bit about our journey of, we use the paved path analogy, I think, like many others, but we get a bit more descriptive with like, if you're on that paved path and you have four-wheel drive, you can go off-roading, right? I think as we focus a lot these days on up leveling our software quality to a bar of like enterprise readiness is how we refer to it. And I think with that, what we found is that a better developer experience actually is achieved when you reduce optionality from folks purposely. So from a developer platform perspective, or even from the infrastructure platform, we would purposely reduce the ability to go off-roading.
Hmm.
And so less choices would create more standardization, and ultimately from a platform perspective, give us these kind of assumptions to rely on. Well, we know if you're using this template, you're enabled with this thing. We know that that thing lets us do some other automated process, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas if you were off-roading on that same journey, we can't always make that assumption. We might be able to test for it and then act, but if we can get everybody onto the same standards, then we can make more of, what I refer to as like a capital P platform instead of just kind of like a collection of disparate things. So
Interesting. So I'm assuming you at Segment or like organization has been working on trying to define that standardization for some time. How
yeah,
does one start with it? Because like when a company sort of like grows, at some point it's like wild wild west, right? Kind of like
yeah.
everyone is off-roading. So how do you kind of like bring people back on the roads in some
Mhm.
ways, or where you draw the line is like, okay, you can still off-road versus sort of like, as you're saying now, is like we're trying to kind of like reduce
Yeah.
everyone to get back on the road.
Yeah, totally. Because to your point too, there's different teams doing different things, and where we can't standardize or where we may not choose to standardize. I do still want people to locally optimize to solve for their problems. Like you mentioned, like we do absolutely have teams that work on iOS SDKs or Android SDKs, and I'm not solving specifically for them. Other than we have CI systems where they can run their tests and things like that. There's ecosystem specific things in those areas that, for better or worse, my team knows nothing about because we're not focused on it. So what I want to do is empower those folks. Absolutely. To your point, we've been on a journey, like I think you see in most companies, where we had engineers early on who were really good at tooling, and so they would create scripts to shorten their cycle, and they'd share them with their friends and share them with other teams. And so it's very natural in terms of like, well, what do we have tooling for? Can we start bucketing that? Okay, that's where we understand there's areas to focus on, et cetera. Um, and then as we take those buckets and formalize them more into, okay, what's generalizable around multiple teams. And so that's where you get the typical ones, I think, of like, okay, we can focus on CI, and that can run for mostly everybody. And then most people have to deploy, and they're going to deploy in containers to these places. Okay, great. What gaps do we want to fill there? So we have a deploy orchestration system that we work on. And so you kind of, I like the idea of it evolving naturally. Like, let the teams self-solve, let the teams focus on their fast feedback loops. But then it just reaches, I mentioned the term enterprise readiness earlier. It's like we've reached a bar now where quality really matters. It's almost maybe full circle back to like, okay, now we just have to go back to basics. Think about software quality. How do we put guardrails around that? And again, that's the reduction of choice. So now it gets a bit more stringent and a bit more of a platform, like I mentioned, with more standards.
Interesting. Is it fair in that case to say that when we think about dev platforms that we cannot be servicing all developers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's a fair statement, and in fact, I'll actually lean on some recent examples where, based on the state of the macroeconomics and Twilio as a business, Segment as a business, and our customers, we've even sometimes oscillated on the theory of who are our customers, right? If we have a team like the deploy team, for example, that works on our orchestration system, I think most of the time developer platform wants to say that our customers are our internal engineers. But what happens? Does anything change if you say, well, our customers are our customers, the people who pay us money?
Right.
Um, do we prioritize differently in that case, right? Like, again, deploys team as an example, I often say that team exists to codify SRE practices into our deploy process for everybody, right? So that not everybody has to wear an SRE hat. And so if you follow that through with that different way of looking at who is our customer, focuses a lot on reliability in the deploy process, focuses a lot on mean time to recovery and automated rollbacks and different deploy strategies with blue green, et cetera. And so it's kind of just a perspective thing, right? You can talk about all those things from an internal customer's perspective too, that of course they want these different strategies, and it'll help them drive their SLOs and SLAs that they may have. But you could also do it from the paying customer's perspective where, well, they want the highest reliability possible and they want obviously the fastest rollback so they don't see the issue that was deployed and things like that. And so it's an interesting conversation to have at the very least. So like, would you prioritize things differently depending on who your customer is and who you're serving?
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
I want to also double click on one other thing, and then we can move to IDPs. Is you mentioned enterprise readiness a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, when I think about enterprise readiness, I've heard it in the context of startups when they're trying to sell to enterprises.
Sure.
Right? They're like, okay, there's like you need like SAML support, you need like RBACs and all of those things. Is that the same definition for you, or is there different version of it?
Yeah, no, great question. And I agree. I think those are maybe more the product side, right? Like getting Segment to be enterprise ready as an application. I think when we think about it in this context, it's more maybe the operational rigor around monitoring SLOs and SLIs
Mm-hmm.
and having a higher reliability in general, right? Things like that. And so there's kind of a whole umbrella under enterprise readiness of it's maybe the catch-all again, but it's things like having a stable stage environment, having end-to-end testing where we might have disparate testing, things like that, right? It's almost a program that encapsulates just software quality and raising the bar for where the bar is higher, right? Like
Right.
we have the product ready to sell to enterprise customers, but we always want to expand the business, right? And our enterprise customers are bigger with higher deal, more expensive deals, et cetera. And so there's associated quality that
I
comes
see.
with that.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so let's dive into IDPs.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, IDPs are talk of town. Backstage is kind of like also growing in popularity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Maybe we start with. I'm still very like I don't think there's like even an official definition of what really constitutes an IDP. So I would
Agreed.
love to. So I would love to for you to kind of like share your perspective on what is the minimum capabilities that one expects
Mm-hmm.
out of IDP, or like kind of like starting from like how do you even define an IDP?
Yeah, no, wildly agree. Mainly because I often will stop people and ask what do they mean by the P, right? So internal developer, and are we talking about portals or are we talking about platforms? Because
Right.
they're not the same. And we mentioned Backstage. I'm sure we will a handful of times too. But Backstage is a framework for one of those, both of those, maybe, right? But like, I think there is distinction in the nomenclature. I think if you're going to build a portal, it's much more about bringing all the disparate information into one place, right? Like if you think about, I think one way I think about this is like the CNCF landscape. Almost every single one of those tools has a UI that you could look at, Grafana, Kubernetes, etc. And do you want to bring that disparate set of UIs to a single place? And maybe you want to pull in a tile or two from each and kind of create your kind of like Frankenstein dashboard, so to speak. But the portal is a jumping off point. From there, you would go maybe to your Argo CD instance, or you'd go to your CI, UI, things like that. Whereas a platform, I think, is far more tied into your infrastructure. And I think Spotify's implementation of their Backstage is the example of this, where, obviously their open source version is different. It's a bit more of the framework, but internally, from what I understand, it is baked in. Like services may even talk to Backstage to find out information about other services and things like that. So Backstage is really orchestrating the entire journey, and that's where you get platforms.
Interesting.
So yeah, I do think that's step zero is, are we talking portals or platforms? I think, we could talk about either in this context. I think we're mostly talking portals. But that, to your point, I don't think we're solidified yet on like, what do those three letters mean? And even when you define one or the other, what does it mean? So yeah, you asked about kind of the core components, right? I think honestly, there's a Venn diagram here in my mind. There's a big overlap. I think where it starts, why the industry started having this conversation is the software catalog. And I think you often do see that from infrastructure or platform organizations because we have the inherent problem of, hey, we need to drive some campaign. We need everybody to migrate a version or upgrade a thing or solve a CVE or whatever. And you inevitably end up with a spreadsheet of a bunch of container names, bonus points if you can convert those to services, um, and then get the service to an owner. And it's inherently always that owner column that starts out blank, and you share it to a bunch of people, and you try to get them to fill it in, and then you can start the campaign and try to drive it, right? So I think at the core here, that's where the need originates, is the software catalog, getting that ownership filled out, and then from there, hopefully the world's a better place. But
Interesting. So obviously, I'm going to ask this now: are we, when we talk about service catalogs, are we in the platform world or the portal world?
I think both. I think that's the Venn diagram I mentioned. I do think that's necessary for both, or a component of both, where in the portal world, it's that jumping off point. It's the UI on top of the spreadsheet, so to speak. But in the platform world, I think it's necessary for the same reason, but also, again, services may need to know about other services, and relying on that catalog is, I don't know if it doesn't necessarily replace service discovery as a service kind of thing, but I do think services consuming that information could be useful, and they could do that with a portal too, but I think a platform is a little more native.
Interesting. So now I'm going to come to my first hot take on
Sure.
IDPs, which is in some ways it does feel like, especially if you think about it from the lens of service catalogs, that primary users of this is actually the platform teams, right? Like kind of like who are going to manage the infrastructure, who are going to kind of like, maintain the underlying service communication and sort of like, like the, what do you call the securities and like all the specifications and configurations. So why do we even call it like an IDP? Shouldn't we not just call it an internal platform portal, right? Like I know it's kind of like you already talked about P being platform or portal, but like in some ways, we are saying is, okay, it's less for developers, more for platform teams. Sure, platform team is also developers, but is that like a fair statement to say?
I think that's how you see it show up originally, because it's where most of them end up on day two, right? You get everything thrown into the catalog, you start assigning the ownership, and then, okay, cool, you've made platform's job 1% easier. But in my case, and talking to other folks of similar size companies and things like that, or talking about this topic, is there's a lighthouse, there's a direction of travel that we're all trying to go down, and I think that's where the developer side of whether it's portal or platform comes back around, right? The full loop here is kind of a help us help you. If you give me your catalog and it's high quality, I can associate all of your services with a team. I can start telling you things about that team. What's their scope? How much do they own? Do they own too much? Can we start evaluating that they don't even have enough people for an on-call that can support that, right? The service pages, if they're high quality, again, it's like the more metadata you give me, we maybe go back to the assumptions and the levers I mentioned earlier, where it's if I have certain pieces of metadata about a service, can I find other pieces that are useful? Maybe we talk about this more later, but in our case, we want to get the services in there and then build a service readiness framework. So you'd go to every services page and you'd kind of see the scorecards, so to speak, about that service. And so there's a feedback loop there. There's ROI for the developer, where, okay, if I tell you a little bit about this and I fill out some more meta information, I can then come back to you and continuously assess, how am I doing? How are my services doing against my other services? How are my services doing against other services that are outside of this team? And then for continuous improvement reasons, not for blame, but where are the hot spots in the org? Hey, this like group of services isn't doing amazing, right? What can we improve about those? Are they overloaded, et cetera? And so that's a lot of, I think, at least in our case, the direction of travel. But I think that's where people want to go with their portals, is more the give us a bit of information, we'll give you back a lot more information, spend time here in your day-to-day, find the things that need your attention, and then go act on them.
Interesting. I would want to double click maybe a little bit on this, and kind of like also goes into a bit of my related like hot take, which is I do find IDPs to have like this producer consumer challenge, where it's like, again, most of the consumption or like, usage of this information is still done by platform teams, but like initial input is needed from product teams.
Right.
at least, right?
Yep.
So in some ways, like at least some of the conversation we've had with large teams, they have this challenge of drifts where teams kind of like reorg happen, people leave, the
Yes.
information can become stale,
Absolutely.
right? And part of the problem is like you have producers, the product teams who kind of like filling in the information, but like is there enough juice in it for them to kind of like keep this information up to date? And I would
Right.
love to hear like what do you think about that?
No, yeah, that's absolutely a core problem. A previous leader of mine, when we were starting this journey, kind of gave me this anecdote that we want to be able to react to reorgs in 24 hours. And when you think about it, once an engineering team is large enough, that does become a problem, right? Services get orphaned. Hey, you had an owner for this thing last time. Oh, it's the wrong owner this time. Oh, who do I go talk to? And it's really tough because you end up with people's names instead of teams. People may or may not be there anymore. They may be moved up, right? So yeah, that is a core problem. I think in our case, what we've done is we've taken our IDP and we've tried to build it into the flow of core processes for engineering. So a good example here is our security team has a SecOps ticketing program, right? So they find vulnerabilities or things that we need to triage, and they'll cut a Jira ticket. And there's a number of fields on that Jira ticket, and one of them is like risk owner. And the risk owner will be like a team, because again, like people should know things teams should, people, etc. And so it'd be a team, but there's more information in Jira that we actually pipe from our backstage. And it's a bit of the hierarchy of the org. So that team is responsible, but who's their director and who's their VP? And we automatically, based on the data that we've populated, fill those people in. So that whole thing couldn't really be done previously. It would get assigned to people that maybe security knew from a previous interaction, right? And so, and again, there's a direction to travel there. If we get the software catalog good enough, can we take that vulnerability and automatically associate and do the whole thing, right? Rather than the person having to pick the team. But that's an example of injecting it into our core processes, because if ever somebody gets assigned a SecOps ticket and they go, wait a second, that's not my service. The to-do is for them to go to backstage, go to the catalog and change the owner, right? And so that's the self-fulfilling of like, wait, I got these things I shouldn't have, or whatever. So yeah, that's our strategy at least.
Interesting. So in a way you're saying is, it seems like it's leaning more towards like the platform side of things, where you're saying, right, like portal versus platform. You're kind of like making, maybe one way I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, is kind of like making it more an active ingredient rather than like, passive, kind of like, it's just not like information, it's also like part of your workflow.
Yes, absolutely. And again, like I think there's the easy things to think about in these portals. Like they all have templates where you can create the repository, right? And honestly, platform engineer's job is very easy when you think about like, oh, what do we do like from repo creation? But by the time you're talking platform, you probably already have a bunch of repos and already have a bunch of services. And how do you get those onto a platform?
Right.
And that's a lot of, I think, this kind of stuff where it's like, okay, once you have it in the catalog, what does it mean? Does that put them on the platform? And then why do they need to stay on the platform? And so, maybe we talk about this too, but I mentioned scorecards earlier and like a service readiness framework. That's another self-fulfilling prophecy, so to speak, where it's once you're kind of in the catalog and we can start evaluating things about you, we need to keep those pieces of metadata at a certain level. Maybe it's test coverage, just an arbitrary example, where if you're not reporting test coverage, you don't get to deploy, right? And so now you have the like gating as part of this, where it's like, well, be in the catalog, be on the platform, be of a certain service quality, and then you can, do your job. Or we gate based on not being in the catalog and not being able to deploy, for example.
Interesting. Yes, I think scorecards is definitely something I would want to dive into. Partly because, historically there have been a bunch of tools, and I'm not going to name specific tools, but like kind of like to measure like developer productivity. And it has like evolved. I think there's been a lot of research done and things are getting in the right direction.
Yep.
But to some degree, again, kind of like, I'm a fan of this book, which was also recommended to me by one of my friends, called Tyranny of Metrics, where there is like just a lot of interest from leadership to kind of like invest heavily into metrics. And I'm sensing more kind of like, from an IDP perspective, that leadership is looking at this as sort of like a new way of measuring metrics.
Yep.
I think two questions I would want to answer in some ways is like, is it actually like replacing some of those old tools or like existing tools from the perspective of like, okay, we were used to measure metrics connecting with like GitHub and Jira only back in the days using these tools, and now we can do that with IDP. And I think second is also the flip side of it, like as developers, they also and software development is sort of like a more creative field, and developers don't like to
Yep.
be big brother or like watched onto
Totally.
that closely. So how do you think kind of like somebody can create a balance, and is this sort of like a new way of like leadership to be tracking these metrics?
Yeah, I think it's a different way, especially in the conversations around productivity. Like, not a fan, do not participate, right? Like, I don't think productivity is the thing there. I think it's more about developer experience and things like that. I think the metrics that go into scorecards, in my opinion, or what I think broadly is they're different. I'll give you some examples where it's like maybe in one of the productivity corners, we would do the DORA metrics. We would see how many times you're deploying, things like that. But in a scorecard, it's different data where I want to evaluate what version of Go are you on? Do I need you at a higher version of Go? So it's much more like, I don't know, the word metadata comes to mind, where it's like I'm evaluating things about the repository or your service. We've got another one, for example, like that assesses if your configuration for deployment is set up in a way where you are properly scalable. Your requests and limits in Kubernetes are not inversed, for example. And that's a small check, but if I can get that far enough left, that saves somebody a botched deploy, right? And so they're just different types. And that's why I associate them to like the service readiness framework, where it's not about the team's productivity or the individual making the changes. It's like the culmination of that thing. Is it ready to go out the door? And then there's an interesting loop where I think the bar is essentially always advancing. So, scorecards love to assign like bronze, silver, gold kind of ratings on these. And so in that example, even if a service was gold today, tomorrow they may not be, because we're going to continuously raise the bars, or even something as rudimentary as like the package version of something, it's going to move, right? And so if you're on version X today, which is where I need you, tomorrow I might need you on Y, and maybe that is a big enough diff to downgrade your service to silver. And I think the culture we want to build with this is that everybody's kind of striving to continuously be gold, right? They go to Backstage or their portal, and to the question earlier of like, why are they going back? They're going back and looking for like the most important thing for them to do that week in their planning or whatever. Oh, hey, we slipped here. There's a new campaign. We need to move X to Y, right? So yeah, it's different metric. I hope for everybody, it's different metrics. Don't measure productivity would be my hot take.
Interesting. So kind of like related to this, are we using signals from these activities that, like for instance, like you were talking about Go version, simpler case, right? Somebody
Yep.
upgrading their Go libraries. Are we using this information in some ways to incentivize like teams and developers? Like, is it sort of like, maybe in your annual cycles, performance cycles, we kind of like say, okay, you have like X gold services,
Yeah.
stuff like that. And I'm curious, like generally kind of like I mean, to some degree, there is always like this carrot and stick approaches. And I'm just trying to figure out like, how are we creating the right incentives for teams to like improving the bottom line. So kind of like,
Right.
like increasing the reliabilities of the systems.
Yeah. Honestly, I haven't thought a whole lot about whether or not it's tied to performance. I don't think so, though, because I think like a lot of metrics and even the productivity metrics, so to speak, they can be gamed. And that's the wrong incentive, I think instead the natural incentive we're creating is, prior to us doing a portal and having this kind of, North Star direction of having like an automated service readiness framework, is we had a non-automated service readiness framework. So even if the incentive is that small, I think that's one of the incentives, where instead of getting an Airtable form or a spreadsheet or something like that once a quarter and asking you to update it for all your services, yada, 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 instead it's be registered in the software catalog, right? And that's it. And we'll come back to you when something lights up red and we need your help to make it green, right? But but yeah, I don't think. Yeah, I don't think this gets tied to performance, right? It's like, hey, what's your number of gold medals, and people just start printing services and getting them to gold. Like, that's not where we want to head.
Okay, we will see how this evolves. Okay, so
Yeah.
you've been working in sort of like internally, spending time kind of like evolving the portal itself. What
Mhm.
has been your biggest learnings, or maybe anything kind of like you want to share with anybody who's just getting started with thinking about building an IDP or like support integrating an IDP internally?
Yeah, no, great question. I think I think early in the journey, there's more to learn than most people think. I think so. So in our case, we had an effort early on to actually try to standardize taxonomy for all of Twilio, right? With simple, maybe M&A case where they already actually had a pretty great platform with solid taxonomy for Twilio stuff. But then when Segment onboarded, they're like, hey, like show us your taxonomy, show us your catalog, and A, we didn't have one, but B, we also couldn't onboard to theirs because their taxonomy system ran their platform, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so we thought of this like, okay, well, there's Backstage and they have a software catalog. Can we standardize it? Blah, blah, blah. We did a lot of research across many different functions. And I think that alone was like the first learning lesson that this tends to originate with engineering. And we think, oh, we're solving engineering problems. We just need a software catalog, et cetera. But many other functions need this data. And that was the second learning lesson. I'll tie them back together is I believe there's kind of three pillars of what the taxonomy needs to be. There's the service catalog, and I actually think that kind of gets extended slightly to cloud resources. Like I think you should also have your S3 buckets and your RDS databases and blah 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 in the catalog and mapped. So that's one pillar. And then I think you have to have your org also represented. So people belong to groups, groups own things, groups roll up to other groups, etc. And then public facing products, I think, is the third pillar because products are made up of maybe features. You can also add that level of granularity, which are run by, one or many services, et cetera, et cetera. So if you want to tie the full loop of it all, tying learning lesson two back is, you might have somebody in customer support who gets a call from a customer about a sev that was just filed about a product, but what services or who should they go talk to in engineering, right? And so you've just traversed this like whole graph of the products represented on segment.com all the way to, oh, there's an outage in US East 1. Like, how do you connect those dots? Um, and so that was the biggest thing early on is like spend time understanding what taxonomy you need to represent, like what questions does the organization want to be able to answer, and what information do you need to do that. But yeah, I think again, most people download a software catalog and they start shoving services into it. Like that will solve a double digit percentage of problems. But I think if you want to go all the way, there's a lot more data to represent. Um, so yeah, that's my. And then maybe the second suggestion is like, yeah, do you want a portal or do you want a platform? Those are different. Understand that I think a portal is maybe easier to get, and a platform requires a lot more integration to your infrastructure stack and your services and things like that.
Interesting. I mean, based on what you've described, do you see that portal can be successful without a platform?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally. I think especially in the world I described earlier, where it's like, let's say you're just a company that is using a bunch of open source CNCF stuff. Like there is value, for example, in A, having the software catalog, and then B, enriching it with kind of all the different pointers to all of the different, CNCF UIs, so to speak. So yeah, the plugins I think can enrich the experience a lot for just a portal. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, all right. So switching gears a little bit, tell us kind of like you spend, I'm guessing at least a year, probably more, working
Mhm.
on IDP. Like,
Yep.
where are things now? What are sort of like maybe some of the things in your roadmap with or without IDP? Kind of like could be also larger DX efforts at Segment. Uh,
Yeah.
but yeah, maybe kind of like give us a glimpse of the maturity of the platform today at Segment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we've been working on our IDP for almost 2 years, if not a little bit more. And again, we started that journey focusing a lot on the taxonomy. So it was a lot of behind the scenes kind of value that people weren't seeing. I think today we focus a little bit more on like daily active users, so to speak, as a metric, and what gets people back there for that day two that we talked about. So that's kind of what's going on in that area. Um, in other areas, on like the enterprise readiness stuff that I mentioned, and we're pretty tangentially involved there, is we're at that stage where, of course, we have like a production environment and a staging environment. We're at a stage where the hypothesis is like people need single tenant, like dev environments. So like I have my own cluster and I can destroy it however I want, right? Rather than stepping on a multi-tenant provider. Um, Somewhere related to that is also this story about like continuous end-to-end testing and maturing that whole story and stuff like that. So I view that, again, whether that's developer platform or runtime or a little both, especially the end-to-end one, like that I think is part of the developer experience. It's the whole journey of how do I get my work done and do it well. And I think those are some of the more recent topics we're wrangling.
Amazing. All right, Jesse, I know we are very close to time, so I want to at least like take a couple of minutes to go through our rapid fire questions.
Yeah, let's do it.
So let's do that. Keep it short, and we'll try to wrap up quickly. So, first question is, what are you most excited about in DX today, or sort of like things which are changing, or anything kind of like in the coming years?
Yeah. I think two things are on my mind here. I think the data and like the research behind DX is getting to a point where a lot more people understand it. It's maybe a bit more mainstream. So I think about surveys that we do, for example, like we now do those based on a SaaS platform, and like instead of our own, we're not we're not research scientists, and so coming up with those questions for a number of years was very difficult. So now there's platforms for those kind of things. So I think there's more platforms in this space around DX that I'm very excited to stop doing ourselves, basically. Um, and the other one, actually, that was the other one too, is like there's just more platforms around, or sorry, there's more products being built around platform. Think like Heroku, but even more modern day is where I'm seeing more tools pop up. Like I was just speaking to a product the other day about infrastructure as code and how they're putting these guardrails around that and things like that. But yeah, there's even companies trying to build the IDP platform from day one. And
Right.
so yeah, if teams don't have to build that,
Interesting.
then great.
Do you think there will be much smaller platform teams in house in future?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess, with where SaaS is going, but I would imagine it just kind of shapes again, right? Like I think there was a big ebb and flow with like SRE, for example, and maybe that's come down a little bit because a lot of those folks have gone to platform and things like that. I think there's like a circle graph or whatever it would be called, and it's just shaping into different areas of what's needed. So yeah, we'll see.
Okay. And according to you, what makes a good engineer for dev platform DevEx role?
Yeah, the in my experience, the best I've seen here are, um, specifically for platform engineering. I think it's the people who have come from a software engineering background, right? Like DevOps engineers. I hate that title, but DevOps engineers or site reliability engineers. They're not just sysadmins with a new title, right? That's a different role. I think it's more the evolution of, hey, I'm a software engineer, I know how to build good product, I know how to take user input, things like that. It's the same SDLC as product, but you're focusing on just a slightly different part of the problem. So
Interesting.
I think having worked on a product team is pretty advantageous to platform engineers.
That's very cool. And what's your take on like coding assistants, co-pilots for developers?
Yeah, I think I'm all for them. We survey on this data too. We have like just in time surveys, for example, where we see, hey, you just closed a pull request. Curious if you used Copilot, and if they say yes, we'll ask, how much time did it save you, etc. I'm all for them. I think we've seen, and hopefully the industry is learning, like you can't do 100% of your job with them. They sometimes spit out code that you don't actually want to run in production. But I think if it's you've written the implementation and you want some help writing the test or vice versa real quick, like I think, engineers have more work than ever. If you can speed that up somehow, do it.
Awesome. And do you like kind of like somewhat similar boat? What's your do you think there are like specific use cases of LLMs that you will see kind of like evolve for developer experience?
Yeah, I mean, this is maybe an example. Even I was thinking about this earlier of like this is maybe one place where like allow me to plug things that somebody build a SaaS where I can plug in my different inputs and you just spit out the bot that lets me query it. But I think the thing I have the most appetite for here is like something that has all of our internal documentation, also all of our code, also maybe the software catalog, like just all of that stuff in one where I can ask it maybe some Sev related stuff. I can ask it some observability stuff where it's like, hey, show me all of the incidents related to service X, between X and Y, right? And so that
Interesting.
would be one angle. But also like, is there a trend there? Did that, I don't know. But like if it has all that context, both like the code and the catalog, how things relate to each other, and then also just like the run books, right? Like that, I think that is wildly useful.
Interesting. So like broadly, a lot of like knowledge systems type of things.
Hmm.
Very cool.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there a tool for DX that you recommend? I mean, preferably DX could also be non-DX related.
Yeah, I think my story here, I don't know if it's becoming dated or not, but I do think it's foundational to the whole like I think DX is obviously very closely related to DevOps. And when people
Mhm.
ask about that, I often refer them first to the Phoenix project as kind of like the thing that broke me into the space. Um, Oh, sorry, you're asking tools. Well, that's a tool in my mind. Virtual was a book.
That's all right. We can also include books in this.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry about that. No, yeah. So books, real quick. I would say like the Phoenix Project, followed by Accelerate, which is more like the research
Right.
behind Dora and things like that. And then now there's the frameworks like the Space framework and things like that. So I think those are some books slash tools. On the tools side, I mentioned we're using a surveying platform now that specifically surveys for the developer experience.
Hmm.
We just had a survey close and we got 97% participation. And
Wow.
obviously on my leadership team, there's also an HR representative. We've got an HR survey at the same time. It does not reach the same participation. So there's some animosity there, a healthy animosity, but like people like the DX survey. They like seeing that the questions are very relatable. They give their input. We act on them as an organization. So I think that in itself, like surveys are a great tool. Um, yeah.
I think, Jesse, this was end of rapid fire. So
Cool.
thank you so much. I know we kind of like can go on forever, but I think
Yeah,
there
of
were
course.
definitely some interesting nuggets here around IDPs that many folks will listen to and hopefully
Awesome.
act on. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. I'll
Yeah,
hopefully see you around in other Hangar DX sessions.
absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yep.
Too.